The Highland Stag had seen better days, much like its patrons. Rain hammered against the grimy windows of the Glasgow pub, each droplet carrying with it the weight of another dreary Tuesday evening. The amber glow of ancient bar lights cast long shadows across weathered faces, nursing pints of bitter and whiskey chasers, creating an atmosphere thick with resignation and the acrid smell of decades-old cigarette smoke that no amount of regulation could fully erase. Behind the bar, Moira McLeod wiped down glasses with practiced efficiency, her keen eyes surveying the familiar collection of regulars who'd made the Stag their second home. There was old Tom in his usual corner, muttering about the government over his fourth pint. Margaret sat by the fireplace, nursing her gin and tonic while scrolling through photos of grandchildren who rarely visited. And there at the bar's far end sat the man who had inadvertently changed the course of human history. Staff Sergeant James Hamish McBride had returned from his third tour in Afghanistan 6 months ago, but the war had followed him home. The medal citations gathering dust in his flat spoke of courage under fire, of lives saved and missions accomplished. What they didn't mention were the nightmares that jolted him awake at 0300 hours, the way his hands shook when helicopters passed overhead, or how the bottom of a whiskey bottle had become his most reliable companion. Hamish stared into his glass, watching the amber liquid swirl as memories of Helmand Province flickered through his mind like a broken film reel. The faces of his squad, Mackenzie with his infectious laugh, Williams who could fix anything with duct tape and determination, Rodriguez who carried pictures of his newborn daughter everywhere. All gone in one terrible moment when the IED tore through their convoy. Another? Moira's voice cut through his reverie. He nodded without looking up. Make it a double. As she poured, the pub's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The temperature dropped several degrees, causing condensation to form on windows and glasses. The ancient fluorescent lights flickered with increasing intensity, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Conversations faltered as patrons glanced around nervously, primitive instincts warning them that something fundamental had changed. Then came the sound, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Glasses rattled on tables. Outside, car alarms began wailing in a discordant symphony of electronic panic. "What the bloody hell?" old Tom started to say, but his words were swallowed by a deafening roar that shook the building to its foundations. The roof of the Highland Stag didn't simply collapse. It was vaporized by energies beyond human comprehension. Where once stood a centuries-old ceiling of oak beams and slate tiles, there was now only open space filled with swirling motes of disintegrated matter. The alien ship descended through this opening with impossible grace, its hull a seamless amalgamation of crystalline structures and metal alloys that shifted between colors like oil on water. The vessel was roughly the size of a city bus, but shaped like a teardrop that had been stretched and twisted by cosmic forces. Bioluminescent veins pulsed along its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly, while sections of the hull rippled like liquid mercury. As it settled onto the pub floor with surprising gentleness, landing struts emerged from hidden recesses, adjusting automatically to the uneven wooden planks. For a moment that stretched into eternity, humans and aliens regarded each other across a gulf of evolution and understanding. The pub's patrons sat frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what their eyes reported. Then, with a sound like crystalline wind chimes caught in a hurricane, a section of the ship's hull dilated open like an iris. 3 beings emerged, and even Hamish's war-tested nerves felt the primal chill of encountering something truly alien. They stood approximately 7 feet tall on legs that bent in too many places, their elongated torsos covered in what appeared to be living armor that breathed and pulsed with its own rhythm. Where humans had faces, these creatures possessed clusters of sensory organs that shifted and reconfigured themselves as they observed their surroundings. The lead alien, for lack of a better term, moved with fluid grace toward the bar. When it spoke, the words bypassed the ears entirely, materializing directly in the minds of everyone present like ice water injected into the brain. Asterisk greetings, primitive ones. We are the KCHVAR Expeditionary Collective. Your species has been evaluated for inclusion in the galactic convergence. Asterisk Margaret dropped her gin, the glass shattering on the floor in a crystalline explosion that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Asterisk, your world shows promise as a resource extraction site. However, your biological and technological development remains disappointing. Moira found her voice first, her Scottish practicality overriding shock. Right then, lads. I don't know what manner of costume party this is, but the Stag's a respectable establishment. You can't just tear through my roof, and the alien sensory cluster swiveled toward her with mechanical precision. Silence, female unit. Your species will be granted the honor of servitude under HFY guidance. Resistance is illogical. That was when Hamish McBride, decorated veteran of 3 combat tours and survivor of horrors that would break lesser men, slowly turned on his bar stool. His weathered face, marked by shrapnel scars and etched with lines of grief, hardened into an expression his enemies in Afghanistan had learned to fear. "Did you just tell my friend to shut up?" His voice was deceptively quiet, carrying the same lethal calm he'd used when calling in airstrikes on Taliban positions. The alien's attention focused on him with predatory intensity. Asterisk, you will demonstrate proper submission, male unit. Your species' violent tendencies are well documented but ultimately irrelevant. Asterisk, Hamish stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 6'2" and built like a Highland warrior of old, he cut an imposing figure even next to beings from beyond the stars. His hands, scarred from handling weapons and roughened by combat, hung loose at his sides. But those who knew him recognized the deceptive relaxation. It was the stillness of a coiled spring, ready to unleash devastating force. Violent tendencies? He took a step forward, and something in his posture made even the other aliens shift nervously. "Mate, you have no bloody idea." Asterisk, your primitive aggression is noted. However, physical resistance against HFY technology is futile. Your weapons are obsolete, your tactics predictable. Asterisk, a smile played across Hamish's lips, not pleasant, but the kind of expression that had made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. Technology, eh? Tell me something, you oversized praying mantis. Have you ever been in a proper pub fight? The alien sensory organs reconfigured themselves in what might have been confusion. Asterisk explained this reference to pub fight. Asterisk old Tom, emboldened by whiskey and a lifetime of Glasgow Street wisdom, let out a wheezing chuckle. "Oh, you poor bastards have no idea what you've walked into." #Hack2. The battle begins. What followed would be analyzed by xenobiologists and military historians for generations, dissected in academic papers with titles like First Contact Protocols in the Glasgow Incident and Asymmetric Warfare in Extraterrestrial Encounters. But in that moment, as Hamish McBride prepared to introduce beings from across the galaxy to the ancient art of Scottish violence, there was only the electric tension of impending chaos. The lead Kefar raised what appeared to be a weapon, a crystalline rod that hummed with barely contained energy. Patterns of light raced along its length, and the air around it began to shimmer with heat distortion. "You will submit or be terminated." "Right," said Hamish, and launched himself forward with the explosive speed that had once earned him recognition as the Royal Marines' unarmed combat champion. The alien, for all its advanced evolution and technological superiority, had never encountered anything quite like a Glasgow-trained soldier who'd spent 3 tours perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. Hamish's first punch, delivered with the full weight of his body behind it, connected with the creature's torso just below what might have been a rib cage. The living armor rippled like water, absorbing some of the impact, but the alien still staggered backward with what sounded like a mechanical gasp. The energy weapon discharged wildly, its beam carving a smoking furrow across the pub's back wall and igniting several bottles of premium whiskey. The flames spread with unnatural eagerness, as if the alien energy had imbued them with aggressive properties. Asterisk impossible. Primitive species cannot. Asterisk the thought was cut short as Hamish grabbed a bar stool and brought it down across the alien's elongated skull with bone-jarring force. The creature's sensory cluster sparked and flickered like a damaged circuit board, and fluorescent blue fluid, presumably blood, began leaking from several orifices. But the Kefar weren't defenseless. The second alien moved with inhuman speed, its weapon charging with a sound like tearing metal. The discharge caught Hamish in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the bar. The smell of burned flesh and fabric filled the air as his jacket began smoldering. "Nobody hurts my customers." Moira McLeod had armed herself with a cricket bat she kept behind the bar for handling rowdy patrons. The weapon, signed by the 1999 Scottish national team, connected with the alien's weapon arm with a crack that echoed like thunder. The energy rod went flying, embedding itself in the wall where it continued to discharge random bolts of destruction. The pub erupted into chaos that would have made Vikings proud. Old Tom, 73 years old and arthritic, proved that Glasgow fighting spirit transcended age and infirmity by breaking a bottle of Buckfast over the third alien's head. Margaret, sweet grandmother of 5, grabbed the nearest chair and began systematically beating the wounded Kefar with the methodical intensity of someone kneading bread. "Take that, you horrible things!" she shrieked, punctuating each word with another blow. "Coming into our pub, threatening our Moira." The aliens, despite their technological superiority, found themselves completely unprepared for the reality of human pack behavior in a confined space. Their weapons, designed for long-range engagement against organized military forces, proved nearly useless in the close confines of a pub brawl. Every discharge risked hitting their own allies or causing catastrophic structural damage. Hamish, his shoulder burned and bleeding, grabbed a bottle of 18-year-old Macallan, the pub's most expensive whiskey, and smashed it across the lead alien's sensory cluster. The creature reeled backward, its thought speech degrading into static bursts of pain and confusion. Error. Human behavioral patterns. Not conforming to predictive models. That's because you never met a proper Scotsman, you alien bastard. Hamish roared, following up with a combination of punches that would have dropped a heavyweight boxer. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Highland Stag became a war zone of broken glass, spilled alcohol, and increasingly desperate alien attempts to restore order. Their advanced armor protected them from the worst damage, but it couldn't account for the sheer, bloody-minded determination of humans defending their territory. The tide turned when young Billy McKenna, barely 21 and built like a rugby forward, managed to grab one of the alien weapons. The crystalline rod felt warm and somehow alive in his hands, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves as he watched. "How's this thing work, then?" He wondered aloud, pointing it at the alien ship. No. "That is classified?" Billy pulled what looked like a trigger. The discharge tore through the ship's hull like tissue paper, revealing glimpses of impossible technology within, chambers filled with swirling energy, walls that existed in more dimensions than the human mind could process, and banks of equipment that pulsed with alien intelligence. Alarms began shrieking from the damaged vessel, sounds that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primitive brain regions responsible for fear and flight responses. Red warning lights bathed the pub in hellish illumination as systems that had traveled between stars began failing catastrophically. Critical damage to navigation array. Probability matrices corrupted. Immediate evacuation required. Delete alien. Blue blood streaming from multiple wounds and its living armor flickering like a dying television, managed to project one final message. This is not over. Primitives, your species will pay for this humiliation. The 3 beings scrambled back into their dying ship with far less dignity than they'd emerged. The hull sealed behind them with obvious desperation, and the vessel began to rise on failing engines that sputtered and sparked with contained lightning. It made it perhaps 50 feet into the air before the damaged systems finally cascaded into complete failure. The ship plummeted back to Earth, crashing through the roof of Mackenzie's fish and chip shop next door in an explosion of alien metal and boiling oil. In the sudden silence that followed the crash, the survivors of the Highland Stag stood amid the wreckage of their world, breathing hard and staring at each other with the wild-eyed intensity of people who had just survived something that should have been impossible. Hamish sat heavily on a bar stool that had somehow survived the chaos, pressing a bar towel to his burned shoulder. The pain was sharp and constant, but it was clean pain, honest pain, the kind he understood. Not like the twisted agony of survivor's guilt that had been eating at him for months. "Well," said Moira, surveying the destruction of her life's work with remarkable composure, "I suppose I'll be needing to call the insurance company." Old Tom laughed, a sound like rusty hinges finally moving freely. That'll be a conversation. "Hello. I'd like to report a claim for alien invasion damage to my pub." Outside, sirens wailed as emergency services responded to reports of explosions and strange lights. Within minutes, the Highland Stag would be surrounded by police, ambulances, fire brigades, and eventually military units trying to make sense of impossible witness statements and alien technology scattered across 2 city blocks. Margaret sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 68 years. Did we really fight off beings from outer space? "That we did, love," Hamish replied, surprising himself at how steady his voice sounded. For the first time in months, the constant noise in his head, the whispers of guilt and self-doubt that had driven him to seek solace in whiskey, had gone quiet. "That we bloody well did." Young Billy McKenna was examining the alien weapon he'd used, turning it over in his hands with the fascination of someone discovering fire. "Look at this thing. It's still warm, and these symbols, they're moving." "Put that down, you daft boy," Moira warned. "We've had enough excitement for one evening." But as Billy set the weapon on the bar, it began to pulse with gentle light, and suddenly everyone in the pub could understand the alien script covering its surface. The symbols weren't just writing. They were compressed data packets containing information about the HFY Collective, their technology, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their plans for Earth. The weapon had been designed to interface with the user's nervous system, downloading tactical information directly into their brain. But it had never encountered a human nervous system before, and the resulting data transfer worked both ways. Even as it fed information about HFY technology to Billy, it was uploading everything it learned about human psychology, tactics, and culture back to the collective. What it discovered would terrify civilizations across the galaxy. Humans, the weapon's AI concluded, were utterly insane by any rational standard. They formed emotional attachments to inanimate objects and abstract concepts. They would sacrifice themselves for strangers without logical reason. They turned recreational activities into competitions and competitions into wars. They had somehow survived and thrived on a planet that was actively trying to kill them through weather, geology, and hostile biology. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to become more dangerous when frightened or cornered, rather than less. The HFY had expected submission once their technological superiority was demonstrated. Instead, the humans had responded with escalating violence that bordered on berserker fury. The AI's final report, transmitted in the microseconds before the weapon's connection to collective was severed, painted a picture of a species so inherently unpredictable and violent that conquest would be not just difficult, but actively counterproductive. Humans, it concluded, were the kind of problem that would spread throughout the galaxy like a virus if disturbed. 20 minutes later, the first police officers arrived to find the Highland Stag's patrons sitting calmly among the wreckage, sharing what remained of the whiskey and occasionally poking at pieces of alien technology with the casual curiosity of farmers examining a crash weather balloon. "Right then," said Constable Davies, a man who thought he'd seen everything in 15 years of Glasgow policing. "What exactly happened here?" Hamish looked around at his fellow survivors, Moira with her cricket bat still in hand, old Tom grinning like a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Margaret straightening her jacket with the dignity of someone who just defended Queen Anne country, young Billy clutching his trophy alien weapon like a child with a new toy. For the first time since his squad had died in Afghanistan, Hamish felt like he was part of something again. Not just a unit, but a family. These people had stood with him against impossible odds, had fought beside him without question or hesitation. They reminded him what he'd been fighting for all along, not flag or country, but the simple right of ordinary people to live their lives in peace. "Aliens, officer," he said simply. "They came looking for a fight, and we gave them one." The constable stared at him for a long moment, then looked around the destroyed pub at the scorch marks, the hole in the roof, the twisted metal debris that definitely hadn't come from any terrestrial source. In the distance, the Mackenzie's fish shop continued to burn with flames that flickered in colors that shouldn't exist. "Aliens," Davies repeated slowly. "Aye," said Moira, pouring him a whiskey without being asked. "Rude ones, too. Came barging in without a buy-your leave, threatening my customers. I've dealt with rowdy oil workers and football hooligans, but these things had no manners whatsoever." Over the following hours, as military investigators arrived and alien technology was catalogued and hauled away, the story of the Highland Stag's stand against the HFY Collective began to spread. Social media exploded with shaky phone videos taken by passers-by. News crews descended on Glasgow like locusts. Government officials issued carefully worded statements about unexplained incidents and ongoing investigations. But in the days and weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Reports began filtering in from around the world. Alien ships withdrawing from previously established monitoring positions, expeditionary fleets altering course to avoid Earth's solar system entirely, and deep space surveillance detecting massive fleet movements as various alien civilizations suddenly found urgent business elsewhere in the galaxy. The Ketbar AI's report had spread through the galactic communication networks like wildfire. Within hours, every major civilization had received the same warning: stay away from Earth. The humans were not worth the risk. The weapon Billy had claimed was eventually studied by teams of scientists who confirmed what the pub survivors had already learned. It contained detailed intelligence about dozens of alien species, their technologies, their plans, and their fears. Earth, previously seen as an easy conquest, was now classified as a Category Omega threat, a designation reserved for species so dangerous that contact was forbidden except in the most extreme circumstances. Hamish McBride, discharged veteran and recovering alcoholic, found himself recruited by a hastily formed international defense initiative. His insights into small unit tactics and asymmetric warfare proved invaluable as humanity began preparing for the inevitable return of alien attention. But more importantly, he'd found purpose again, not just in defending Earth, but in training the next generation of defenders. The Highland Stag was rebuilt within 6 months, funded by a combination of insurance payments, government compensation, and donations from around the world. The new roof was reinforced with materials reverse-engineered from alien hull plating. The bar stools were bolted down, and mounted prominently behind the bar, next to Moira's cricket bat, was a plaque reading, "The day we taught the galaxy not to mess with Earth, July 23, 2024. Every year on that date, the survivors gathered at the Stag to commemorate what historians now call First Contact Day. They raised their glasses in memory of the simple truth that had saved humanity: never start a bar fight with humans, because we've been perfecting the art of violence for millennia, and we take it very personally when someone threatens our friends. The last transmission ever received from the HFY Collective was brief and to the point, asterisk warning to all species: avoid SOL system. Humans are insane. Repeat, humans are insane. It was ironically the most accurate assessment any alien species had ever made of humanity. And in the Highland Stag, where it all began, Hamish McBride raised his glass to that truth every single night. "Here's to being completely mental," he would say, and the regulars would drink to that. After all, insanity was just another word for unpredictability. And in a galaxy full of logical, rational civilizations following predictable patterns, being utterly unpredictable was the greatest weapon humanity could possess. The war never came. But if it had, the aliens would have learned what the Ketvar discovered that night in Glasgow. You don't pick fights with a species that considers bar brawls a recreational activity and treats desperate last stands as Tuesday evening entertainment. Some nights when the whiskey was flowing and the stories were being told, Hamish would look around at his friends, his family, and smile. They'd saved the world without meaning to, simply by being exactly what they'd always been, stubborn, violent, loyal, and absolutely unwilling to back down from a fight. The galaxy was a safer place because of it, and every now and then, when the evening light slanted just right through the reinforced windows of the Highland Stag, you could still see scorch marks on the walls where alien weapons had fired in those chaotic minutes that changed everything. The marks served as a reminder, not of what humanity had survived, but of what it was capable of when properly motivated. The universe had learned to leave Earth alone. But more importantly, James McBride had learned to live with himself again, surrounded by friends who'd stood with him when the impossible became inevitable. Sometimes that's all the victory anyone needs.